Welcome back. Today's movie will be a 1996 French war drama film titled Captain Conan. So sit back, relax and enjoy the video. The movie begins near the end of World War I in 1918. The French army joined forces with Captain Conan's ruthless combat men against the Bulgarians. Conan leads a group of thugs and murderers who work with him in his missions on the battlefield. One night, as the war ends, Conan, along with his men, goes on a surprise attack and confronts the enemies eye to eye as they boldly fight with their knives. After completing their mission, Conan visits one of his injured men, which shows his caring concern for his comrades. He then shows Lieutenant Norbert, his good friend, the location of their hideout, where his men are preparing lunch. Singing can be heard as the group get together to eat, and they warmly welcome Norbert and treats him like their own. This shows Conan's strong relationship with his comrades in opposition to the military hierarchy. He only respects two of his fellow officers, Lieutenant Norbert, a former academic, and Deceive, a nobleman. While walking, Conan explains that the nature of their job is unlike the army. They don't fight like ordinary soldiers. Instead, they fight in a way that they butcher their enemies, which he admits is hard to stomach. Later that night, the whole camp is alerted as they receive the news of an attack on Deceive's sector. Thus, Norbert immediately calls for Conan's help. They confirm that the enemies are attempting to advance as they inspect the area of Deceive's sector. They ensure that the enemies are trying to advance. Thus, Conan and his men will no longer work on their own. Instead, they are assigned to the machine gun unit to fight with the army, which Conan thinks his men will need to adapt to. The next day, the army gathers for a prayer before they go to war as the other men prepare to go uphill for battle. Hundreds of men are determined to fight for their country to reclaim peace again. Meanwhile, Conan and his men proceed with their plan to combat the enemy in a surprise attack while the army goes to the front lines. The battle depicts the realistic horrors of war as men put their lives on the line. Fortunately, Conan and his men successfully invade the site of the enemy and fearlessly attack them. As they rest after seizing the enemies, they receive an order from the colonel to hold the ridge and await orders, which Conan thinks is ridiculous. He disobeys the order since their allies are retreating. Thus, he sends the messenger away. For 2 days, the battle drags on endlessly, with more casualties returning to camp. Fortunately, the relentless effort of Conan's unit pays off as they infiltrate the enemy base. They sneakily make their way in and quickly eliminate them, but they inevitably lose 2 of their men. Later that day, the entire army gathers to hear the momentous announcement of their victorious win on all fronts with the aid of its allies. This marks the end of the war as an armistice is established. After that, the army travels for a few days by train to Bucharest in Romania, an ally of France. They find Deceive and his unit on their way to their destination. They were captured and are finally liberated from their enemies. They eventually reached Bucharest and will stay there for a while as they await further orders. When Conan arrives at the station, a sergeant stops and does not recognize him. The sergeant immediately salutes him as soon as he sees his rank and explains that Bucharest's food and water supply in Bucharest is lacking. Nonetheless, the women are beautiful. This is good news for Conan as the travel is worth it because of the women. A few days in, reports of Conan's men stirring many problems in the city raise concerns as the civilians are worried for their safety. Conan's men continue to cause trouble even if Norbert catches them in the act since they use Conan as a trump card, knowing his loyalty to his comrades. Norbert is furious to hear their excuse and assures them they will be punished. Meanwhile, Conan meets a beautiful woman in the bar and spends more time with her as they rest in the city. In a gathering, the superiors remind them that they are still at war with the Hungarians and that while they stay in an allied country, they should avoid any misconduct. But, unknown to them, Conan's men are already bringing too much trouble and reports are piling up. In a dinner meeting, the superiors appoint Norbert as a judge advocate for the upcoming court-martial. They consider him a competent candidate as he is an academic graduate. Still, Norbert is very hesitant since he has no background in law. Still, his superiors insist he takes on the job as they need him to defend the imprisoned soldiers. Conan is offended by their comments. They use his men as an example of people guilty of terrible acts. Therefore, they should be imprisoned instead of innocent. After the meeting, Conan confronts Norbert and warns him that he'll be like their corrupt superiors by accepting the job. He then reads a couple of reports given to Norbert. He finds them ridiculous since the accused are all privates with very lenient crimes, and he has seen colonels do worse. As he leaves the dorm, the principal approaches him and complains about the terrible misconduct of his men. At first, he tries to dismiss it by threatening him not to report them, but when he is informed that they are grilling pork right now, he immediately rushes to their room. He immediately scolds them for their foolishness and orders them to march in the cold evening. It may look convincing, but this is a front to let his superiors see that he is disciplining them for their rowdy behavior. Nevertheless, he still chooses to tolerate them and tells them to have fun but stay out of trouble. The next day, Norbert arrives at the military prison as a judge advocate at the court-martial session. His first case is theft, and he carefully listens to the accused, who is impressed by Norbert's competence. While at the court session, Norbert successfully defends an Arab who mistakenly took the wrong train and crossed a border. This shows that Norbert is fit for the job even though it is his first time doing it. One night at the Crystal Palace, while Conan and other guests enjoy an entertaining live show, masked robbers quickly invade and fatally injure 2 people. Conan witnesses the scene and is left in disbelief. The next day, Mrs. Madeline Erlaine, a noblewoman, arrives in Bucharest hoping to find a way to release her son, Jean. Instead, he is accused of being a traitor that sided with the enemy. She asks for the general's assistance to help prove that Jean is innocent. Meanwhile, the superior tries to convince Norbert to permanently take on the job as a judge advocate, for they are impressed by how he handled the cases from previous court sessions. Norbert rejects the recommendation but immediately changes his mind when informed of the numerous reports against Conan and his men. He thinks he can only save them by accepting the offer to defend them. Later that day, Conan discourages Norbert again from continuing the job. Still, Norbert suddenly becomes serious when he reveals the complaints against them. He specifically emphasizes the involvement of Conan's men in the Crystal Palace robbery as his first major case. They almost get into an argument at the mention of his men accused of the crime. Conan thinks that Norbert is betraying them. Thus, Norbert explains that if he doesn't take the job, someone will replace him and will surely gravely punish his men. Norbert is now investigating the case of the Crystal Palace and takes in some of Conan's men for questioning. He also visits one surviving victim to see her condition suddenly. Conan arrives and shows evidence that his 2 men, Bullard and Grenise, are not responsible for the attack as they were stationed during the incident. However, he knows that the evidence is forged. Thus, he tries to convince Conan to stop protecting murderers. At the superior's office, he is continuously pressured to settle the case by forcing the suspects to confess. Amidst the ongoing investigation, Conan threatens him to stay away from his men. The next day, Norbert and other inspectors execute a house search in the women's dormitory connected to the suspects. They find Miss Georgette as a possible witness to the case and ask for her statement. She cooperates with them by confirming Forgel from the pictures, who extort money from women using threats. She adds that Forgel has a lot of money to take 3 women at once and reveals his hideout near the Crystal Palace. There is enough information for them to pin the crime on Forgel, one of Conan's men. After that, Norbert summons Forgel for interrogation and corners him with many questions. He does not enjoy pressuring Conan's men to confess, but he needs to do it to know the truth so he can defend them properly in the court. During the court session, he gives an impressive statement by providing the choice to the judges to punish the honorable men of war by death or acquit them instead. He chooses a neutral side which gains Conan's praise. In the end, the accused only gets jail time for 3 years, and the case closes. With reports all settled, the soldiers receive an order to go to Sofia to replace colonials and fight the Russians. They immediately travel by train, where Conan and Norbert engage in a serious conversation regarding the previous case involving Conan's men. Conan says that his boys were praised for killing their enemies back in the day, but now that they are in an armistice agreement, they are no longer needed. Thus, they are discarded with 3 years in prison. However, he thinks killing is normal since it is a valuable skill in war. Days later, they arrive at Sofia, and Mrs. Madeline meets with Norbert requesting his help with her son's case. She claims that Jean took refuge at a church and did not betray the army. Norbert considers Jean's case and meets with him. Jean insists that he got lost while following Deceive's order. Thus, Norbert meets Deceive to know his side of the story as the one who accused Jean of deserting the enemy. Deceive claims that Jean is a coward and a habitual deserter. Thus, he pressed charges against him. At a spa, Norbert asks for Conan's help finding the truth about Jean's case. He agrees to help and interrogates Jean. At first, he calmly gently asks him questions, but suddenly, he threatens Jean with a gun to talk, and Jean is entirely horrified by the gesture. Conan confirms that Jean is a coward and can never betray the army. He then tries to convince Deceive to drop the charges, but Deceive firmly believes that Jean is a traitor. With no hope of changing his mind, they go to the field to investigate the place where Jean supposedly deserted. Conan explains that since Jean is a coward, he unintentionally flees from the battle and arrives at the enemy's base. They conclude that Jean is not a traitor. At the court, Norbert and the defendant try their best to convince the judges that Jean is not a deliberate deserter but a vulnerable boy who got lost in his situation. But all their efforts are not enough to acquit Jean. Thus, he is sentenced to death. Because of this, Norbert resigns from his judicial functions, but his superior refuses because it's up to the superior when to dismiss him. After that, they are ordered to battle in Sofia against the Russians. While on the way to their destination, Sergeant Lanzek initiates a rebellion by disobeying the military order and insists that the war has been over for 7 months. He refuses to do his duty and only wants to return home. This concern reaches the general, and he calls Lanzek out and his comrades who agree with him. The general punishes the soldiers for insubordination and orders them to guard at the front lines. As they arrive at the border, the general only plans to guard the roads, but Conan also suggests protecting the river. The general disagrees as the river is too deep and says it's impossible to attack from there. Still, Conan orders to post a machine gun unit on the riverside. After a while, the soldiers see a movement from the tall grass across the river. The soldiers prepare, and their enemies emerge from the waters using boats. Exactly where Conan expects them to come from, the battle starts as gunshots and explosions are heard everywhere. Conan fights the Russian to death until the enemies retreat. By the end of the battle, the river turns red with bodies everywhere. Jean, who is at the front line, does not flee and dies an honorable death. Norbert sends a letter to Mrs. Madeline to inform her that her son died honorably while fighting for his country, as his courage redeemed him this time. The movie ends a few years after the war, and Norbert reunites with Conan in a bar. The old fearless Conan is now a dying man with only 6 months to live. Nevertheless, he appreciates seeing him again after a long time, and together they reminisce about the war, now that they live peacefully in their homeland. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.